The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Brooks adjusted his black robes as he settled into his high-backed leather chair, his steel-gray hair and stern expression reflecting his 20 years on the bench. At 62 years old, he had earned a reputation as one of the strictest judges in the Philadelphia County Courthouse. The clock on the wall showed exactly 9:00 a.m. when Judge Brooks picked up his gavel. The courtroom was already filled with the usual Monday morning crowd, anxious defendants, tired lawyers, and court staff going through their routine. His clerk, Mary Patterson, a thin woman in her 50s, began organizing the day's files with practiced efficiency. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "The Court of Common Pleas is now in session, the Honorable Judge William Brooks presiding." Judge Brooks surveyed the courtroom with his characteristic stern gaze. He took pride in running his courtroom like a well-oiled machine. Tardiness, casual behavior, or any sign of disrespect for court procedures were sure to earn his disapproval, and often a hefty fine. "First case on the docket," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years of practice. "Johnson versus Metropolitan Housing Authority." The lawyers approached the bench, and proceedings began as usual. Judge Brooks listened to arguments with his typical attention to detail, occasionally interrupting to ask pointed questions. The morning proceeded smoothly until 9:45 a.m., when the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The sound immediately drew Judge Brooks's attention. He looked up, his blue eyes narrowing at the interruption. A black woman in her mid-30s had entered the courtroom. She wore a well-tailored navy blue suit and carried a leather briefcase. Despite her professional appearance, Judge Brooks felt his jaw tighten at the disruption. "Miss Patterson," he said loudly, addressing his clerk while staring directly at the woman who had just entered. "Please note that we have a late arrival disrupting court proceedings." The woman began walking towards the front of the courtroom with confidence, but Judge Brooks wasn't having it. In his 2 decades on the bench, he had developed certain expectations about how people should conduct themselves in his courtroom. This kind of disruption was exactly what he wouldn't tolerate. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "This court begins promptly at 9:00 a.m. Your late arrival is a disruption to these proceedings." The woman opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Brooks raised his hand, cutting her off before she could utter a word. The entire courtroom had gone silent, all eyes moving between the judge and the woman who stood calmly in the center aisle. "In this courtroom, we maintain order and respect for the judicial process," Judge Brooks continued, his tone becoming increasingly stern. "Your late arrival shows a clear disregard for this court's time and procedures." The woman maintained her composed demeanor, holding her briefcase in front of her with both hands. She appeared unruffled by the judge's harsh tone, which only served to irritate him further. "For your contempt of court and disruption of proceedings, you are hereby fined $500, Judge Brooks declared, bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Several of the regular court staff exchanged glances. They were used to Judge Brooks's strict demeanor, but something about this interaction felt different. The woman's professional appearance and calm demeanor didn't match their usual experience with tardy defendants. The woman took another step forward, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may pay the fine at the clerk's office," Judge Brooks interrupted, already looking down at the papers on his bench. "Miss Patterson, please make a note of the fine." Now, returning to the matter at hand. Little did Judge Brooks know that his hasty judgment was about to lead to one of the most humbling moments of his judicial career. The woman he had just fined stood quietly for a moment, her expression unreadable, before taking a seat in the gallery. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the dust particles in the air, as the stage was set for what would become a powerful lesson in prejudice and presumption. The tension in courtroom 302 remained thick as Sarah Washington sat quietly in the gallery. Her fingers lightly touched the leather briefcase on her lap, which contained important mediation documents for the day's biggest case. She glanced at her watch. She was indeed 45 minutes late, but for good reason. In the matter of Reynolds Construction versus City Development, Judge Brooks announced, shuffling through his papers, "Are all parties present?" 2 lawyers stood up from different tables, the first one, representing Reynolds Construction, cleared his throat nervously. Your Honor, we are waiting for our court-appointed mediator. She should be here any. More delays? Judge Brooks interrupted, his face reddening. This case has been on my docket for far too long. Who is this mediator? Before anyone could answer, Sarah rose from her seat. That would be me, Your Honor. Sarah Washington, court-appointed mediator. Her voice was clear and professional, carrying across the courtroom with quiet authority. Judge Brooks looked up sharply, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the woman he had just fined. You, he said, disbelief evident in his tone. You're the mediator? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. I apologize for my late arrival. I was completing an emergency mediation session in room 405. Judge Martinez requested my assistance this morning in a sensitive custody case that needed immediate attention. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Several lawyers who regularly worked in the courthouse were exchanging knowing looks. They were familiar with Sarah Washington's reputation as one of the most successful mediators in the state. Judge Brooks's face went through a series of subtle changes, from confusion to disbelief, and then to something that looked like embarrassment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down easily. Being a mediator doesn't excuse tardiness, Ms. Washington. The fine stands. Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a document. I have Judge Martinez's written request here, Your Honor. As you know, emergency mediations take precedence, according to Court Rule 305D. Her voice remained respectful but firm. A young law clerk rushed into the courtroom at that moment, slightly out of breath. He hurried to the bench and handed Judge Brooks a note. The judge's face tightened as he read it, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the paper. The note, as the courtroom would soon learn, was from Judge Martinez himself, praising Sarah Washington's exceptional work in successfully mediating a complex custody battle that morning. The mediation had prevented a lengthy court battle and helped two warring parents reach an agreement that prioritized their children's well-being. Judge Brooks cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. The courtroom watched as he struggled with his earlier hasty judgment. Ms. Washington, he began, his voice slightly less stern than before. Perhaps we should discuss this matter in my chambers after. With all due respect, Your Honor, Sarah interrupted gently. We have a full meditation session scheduled for today. Several parties have traveled considerable distances to be here. Perhaps we should proceed with the case at hand, and we can address the other matter later. Her professional handling of the situation made Judge Brooks's earlier treatment of her seem even more inappropriate. Several attorneys in the courtroom were nodding in approval at her composed response. Very well, Judge Brooks managed, trying to maintain his dignity. Please proceed with the mediation briefing. As Sarah began outlining her approach to the complex construction dispute, her expertise became immediately apparent. She referenced relevant case law, demonstrated a thorough understanding of construction contracts, and proposed a clear framework for negotiations. The lawyers who had been anxiously awaiting her arrival visibly relaxed as she took control of the situation. Even Judge Brooks found himself leaning forward, impressed despite his earlier prejudgment, as she expertly broke down the complicated issues into manageable parts. Throughout her presentation, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, giving no indication that she had been insulted just minutes before. But everyone in the courtroom understood what had happened. A highly qualified professional had been prejudged based on her appearance and race, by none other than the person tasked with upholding justice. The morning sun had risen higher now, its bright rays highlighting the uncomfortable truth that hung in the air. Sometimes those who are supposed to dispense justice need to examine their own biases first. The mediation session began in one of the courthouse's conference rooms, a large space with windows overlooking the city. Sarah Washington sat at the head of the long wooden table, with representatives from Reynolds Construction on one side and City Development on the other. Judge Brooks had decided to observe the proceedings, something he rarely did, taking a seat quietly in the corner. Sarah opened her leather briefcase and pulled out several neatly organized files. Before we begin, she said, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and warmth, I'd like to review the key points of disagreement in this case. The lawyers and their clients sat up straighter, immediately responding to her professional demeanor. From his corner, Judge Brooks watched as she expertly laid out the complex dispute over the city's development project. Reynolds Construction claims $2.3 million in unpaid work and delays, Sarah stated, looking at her notes. City Development counters that the work was substandard and deadlines were missed. Is this correct? Both parties nodded. The tension in the room was thick. This case had been dragging on for months, with neither side willing to budge. Mr. Reynolds, Sarah turned to the construction company owner, a man in his 50s wearing a slightly wrinkled suit. Could you share your perspective first? As James Reynolds began speaking about the challenges his company had faced, Sarah listened intently, taking careful notes. She occasionally asked clarifying questions that showed her deep understanding of construction processes and contract law. Judge Brooks found himself leaning forward, impressed by her handling of the situation. This was clearly not her first high-stakes mediation. The woman he had fined and dismissed earlier was demonstrating a level of expertise that put many of his regular attorneys to shame. When the city development representative, Maria Chen, began presenting their side, Sarah's approach shifted subtly. She picked up on technical details that even the lawyers had overlooked, asking pointed questions about building codes and permit timelines. If I understand correctly, Sarah said, drawing a diagram on her notepad, the main dispute centers around these three construction phases. She turned the pad around, showing a clear timeline of events that made both parties nod in recognition. From his corner, Judge Brooks noticed something remarkable. The hostile glares between the parties had softened. Sarah's calm presence and clear analysis were already having an effect. Your Honor, called out Thomas Ward, a senior partner from the city's most prestigious law firm who had just entered the room. I apologize for interrupting, but I needed to personally thank Ms. Washington for her exceptional work on the Martinez case this morning. The room fell silent. Judge Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ms. Washington, Ward continued, that custody agreement you crafted was brilliant. Judge Martinez asked me to tell you that both parties have already signed it. You probably saved those children years of court battles. Sarah smiled warmly but professionally. Thank you, Mr. Ward. Please tell Judge Martinez I was happy to help. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're in the middle of another important matter. The senior partner nodded respectfully and left. The brief interruption had an unexpected effect on the room. The clients from both Reynolds Construction and City Development were looking at Sarah with newfound respect. Even their lawyers seemed more attentive. Judge Brooks watched as Sarah smoothly brought the focus back to the construction dispute. She was now drawing out specific points of agreement, carefully documenting each one. Her method was subtle but effective. Instead of dwelling on the conflicts, she was helping the parties see their common ground. I see potential for a workable solution here, she said, reviewing her notes. Mr. Reynolds, your company has an impressive track record of completing similar projects. And Ms. Chen, the city's concerns about quality control are valid. What if we structured an agreement that addresses both? As she began outlining a possible compromise, Judge Brooks couldn't help but reflect on his earlier behavior. The woman he had dismissed and fined was not only a highly respected mediator, but also someone who had already resolved a difficult case that very morning. His assumptions about her, based solely on her appearance and late arrival, now seemed not just unfair but embarrassingly unprofessional. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference room as Sarah continued guiding the parties toward a resolution. Her expertise, professionalism, and quiet confidence were undeniable. The morning's confrontation in the courtroom felt like a distant memory, but its lesson was becoming clearer with each passing minute. During the afternoon break, Judge Brooks retreated to his chambers and sat heavily in his leather chair. He pulled up his computer and began searching for information about Sarah Washington. With each click, his embarrassment grew deeper. Sarah Washington's credentials filled the screen before him. Harvard Law School, graduated with honors. Former partner at Wilson & Reed, one of the nation's top law firms. Founder of the Community Justice Initiative. Featured in Legal Times magazine as one of the top 40 under 40 legal professionals. Her mediation success rate was an astounding 95%, one of the highest in the state. A knock on his chamber door interrupted his research. Come in, he called out, quickly minimizing the browser window. Mary Patterson, his clerk, entered with a stack of files. Your Honor, I have something you should see. She placed a folder on his desk. These are Ms. Washington's previous mediation reports from our courthouse. Judge Brooks opened the folder and began reading. Over the past year alone, Sarah had successfully mediated more than 50 high-stakes cases in their courthouse. Her detailed reports showed a brilliant legal mind at work. Complex disputes resolved with creative solutions that left both parties satisfied. There's more, Mary said quietly. Remember the Thompson manufacturing case last month? The one everyone thought would take years to resolve. Judge Brooks nodded. It had been a complicated dispute involving multiple parties and millions of dollars. Ms. Washington resolved it in 2 days, Mary continued. Judge Martinez couldn't stop talking about it, said it was the most skillful mediation he'd ever witnessed. The weight of his morning's mistake pressed harder on Judge Brooks's shoulders. He had not only found a highly respected legal professional, but had done so based on nothing more than his own prejudiced assumptions. Through his office window, he could see Sarah in the courthouse garden taking a short break. She was sitting on a bench, reviewing notes from the morning session. Several lawyers stopped to greet her, showing a level of respect that spoke volumes about her standing in the legal community. A new email notification popped up on his computer screen. It was from Judge Martinez. Bill, I heard about what happened this morning with Sarah Washington. You should know she was late, because I specifically requested her help with an emergency custody case. Her intervention likely saved 2 children from years of trauma. She's one of the best mediators I've worked with in my 30 years on the bench. Just thought you should know. Judge Brooks closed his eyes for a moment. In his 20 years as a judge, he had prided himself on being fair and impartial. Yet this morning, he had revealed a bias he hadn't even realized he carried. Looking through his chamber window again, he watched as Sarah gathered her materials and headed back to the conference room. Her professional demeanor hadn't wavered once, despite his treatment of her. She had handled the situation with a grace that made his actions seem even more shameful. Your Honor, Mary spoke up again. The Reynolds versus City Development mediation will be resuming in 5 minutes. Will you be observing again? Judge Brooks stood up, straightening his robes. Yes, Mary, I will. And please clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. I believe I owe Ms. Washington a proper apology. As he walked back to the conference room, Judge Brooks noticed things he had missed earlier. The way other judges nodded respectfully when Sarah passed by. How the courthouse security guards greeted her by name. The way young law clerks looked at her with admiration. He paused at the conference room door, watching as Sarah expertly guided the parties back to their seats. Her command of the room was subtle but complete. She was reviewing the morning's progress, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and empathy. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene. Judge Brooks felt a profound sense of humility wash over him. In all his years on the bench, preaching about justice and fairness, he had failed to recognize his own prejudices. The woman he had dismissed so quickly this morning was not just a mediator. She was a master of her craft, respected by her peers, and trusted by the entire legal community. As he took his seat in the corner, Judge Brooks realized that today's greatest lesson in justice wouldn't come from his bench, but from the professional he had wrongly judged. As the afternoon mediation session continued, Judge Brooks found himself increasingly distracted by his own thoughts. From his corner seat, he watched Sarah Washington skillfully guide both parties toward a resolution, but his mind kept returning to his morning's behavior. The conference room had grown warmer as the day progressed. City Development's lawyer had removed his jacket, and Mr. Reynolds had loosened his tie. Yet Sarah remained perfectly composed, her professional demeanor unchanged since morning. Let's review our progress, Sarah said, standing to write key points on the whiteboard. We've agreed on the validation process for completed work, and we've established a timeline for remaining inspections. Now, let's address the payment schedule. Judge Brooks noticed how she stood, confident but not intimidating, authoritative but approachable. It was a stark contrast to his own style of commanding respect through fear and strict rules. A memory from his early days as a judge suddenly surfaced. 20 years ago, another judge had taken him aside and said, "William, remember that true justice requires us to look beyond our first impressions." He had nodded then, thinking he understood. Now, watching Sarah work, he realized how far he had strayed from that wisdom. During a brief break, Judge Brooks overheard 2 lawyers talking in the hallway outside the conference room. "Washington is handling this perfectly," one said. "Remember when this case first came to court? Everyone thought it would end in a costly trial. That's why I always recommend her to my clients, the other replied. Did you hear about the hospital dispute she resolved last month? 3 years of litigation, and she settled it in a week. Judge Brooks felt his face grow warm. He had nearly derailed today's mediation with his prejudiced behavior. How many other times had he made snap judgments based on appearances? Inside the conference room, Sarah was having a quiet conversation with the city's representative. Her questions were precise, her suggestions practical. Years of experience were evident in every word she spoke. Your proposed timeline is ambitious, she was saying, but if we adjust these inspection dates, it could work. Mr. Reynolds, would you be open to discussing a modified schedule? The construction company owner, who had been resistant all morning, nodded thoughtfully. If we can get the payment structure you suggested, I think we can make it work. Judge Brooks watched as Sarah smiled, not the bright, showy smile of someone scoring points, but the quiet, satisfied expression of a professional seeing progress. A young law clerk entered the room with a stack of documents. Ms. Washington, she said respectfully, Judge Martinez asked me to give you these. He said they might be helpful for tomorrow's mediation. Thank you, Jessica, Sarah replied warmly. Please tell him I'll review them this evening. The interaction struck Judge Brooks hard. While he had been treating Sarah like an unwelcome intruder, she was actually a trusted and valued member of the courthouse community. As the afternoon wore on, Judge Brooks observed more subtle details he had missed earlier. How Sarah remembered every detail without constantly checking her notes. How she anticipated potential problems before they arose. How she guided conversations away from confrontation without seeming to direct them at all. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, when Sarah began summarizing the day's progress. We've made significant steps forward, she said, reviewing her notes. Tomorrow, we'll focus on finalizing the payment schedule and quality control measures. I'll draft a preliminary agreement tonight for everyone to review in the morning. The parties gathered their materials, looking more hopeful than they had in months. Even their lawyers seemed relieved at the progress. Judge Brooks remained in his seat as others filed out of the room. He watched as Sarah organized her documents with careful precision, her movements unhurried despite the late hour. The weight of his morning's mistake felt heavier than ever. He had allowed his preconceptions to blind him to the reality before him, a highly qualified professional who commanded respect not through force or authority, but through competence, intelligence, and dignity. As Sarah packed her briefcase, Judge Brooks realized that tomorrow's apology would need to be more than just words. It would need to reflect a genuine understanding of how his actions had contributed to the very injustices he was sworn to prevent. Early the next morning, Judge Brooks arrived at the courthouse before sunrise. He sat in his chambers, rehearsing what he would say to Sarah Washington. The morning's first light was just beginning to streak through his window when a knock came at his door. Come in, he called out, straightening his tie. Mary Patterson entered with a concerned look. Your Honor, Ms. Washington is here. She's brought the draft agreement from yesterday's mediation for your review. Judge Brooks took a deep breath. Please send her in, Mary. Sarah entered the chamber, professionally dressed in a gray suit, carrying her familiar leather briefcase. Good morning, Your Honor, she said politely. Ms. Washington, please sit down. Judge Brooks gestured to the chair across from his desk. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed unusually loud. Before we discuss the mediation agreement, Judge Brooks began, his voice softer than usual, I owe you an apology. My behavior yesterday morning was completely unacceptable. Sarah sat quietly, her expression neutral but attentive. The morning light caught the silver streaks in her dark hair as she waited for him to continue. I made assumptions about you based solely on your appearance, he continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. I acted with prejudice, the very thing I've sworn to stand against as a judge. He picked up a pen from his desk, then put it down again, a nervous gesture he rarely showed. After watching you work yesterday, after learning about your impressive career and reputation, I feel even more ashamed of my actions. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Your Honor, may I speak frankly? Judge Brooks nodded, noticing how she maintained her professional tone despite the personal nature of the conversation. What happened yesterday isn't unique to you or this courthouse, Sarah said carefully. As a black woman in law, I've faced similar assumptions throughout my career. People see me and make instant judgments about my qualifications, my background, my right to be in certain spaces. She opened her briefcase and removed a folder. The real question is, what are we going to do about it? Judge Brooks blinked, surprised by her response. We? Yes, we, Sarah confirmed. You see, Your Honor, an apology in private, while appreciated, doesn't address the larger issue. The real problem is the system that makes such assumptions seem natural in the first place. Judge Brooks felt a mix of shame and admiration. Here was someone he had wronged, now offering him a chance to make meaningful change. What would you suggest? He asked, reaching for a legal pad. Sarah placed the folder on his desk. I brought some proposals along with the mediation agreement. Ideas for bias training in the courthouse, mentoring programs for minority law students, community outreach initiatives. Judge Brooks opened the folder, noting how thoroughly prepared she was, as if she had anticipated this very conversation. These are excellent proposals, he said, scanning the documents. But I sense there's more. Sarah smiled slightly. There is. I believe the most powerful statement would be for you to publicly acknowledge what happened and announce these initiatives yourself. Not to shame you, but to show others that even experienced judges can recognize and correct their biases. The suggestion made Judge Brooks uncomfortable, but he recognized its wisdom. That would be challenging, he admitted, but necessary. Change usually is, Sarah replied, but consider the message it would send to every person who enters this courthouse. That justice truly is blind, and when it fails to be, we have the courage to correct ourselves. Judge Brooks stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the courthouse steps where people were beginning to arrive for the day's proceedings. Each person coming up those steps deserved equal treatment, regardless of their appearance. Ms. Washington, he turned back to face her, I would be honored to work with you on implementing these changes. Sarah stood as well, extending her hand. Then let's begin, Your Honor. We have a lot of work to do. As they shook hands, the morning sun fully broke through the window, filling the chamber with light. It felt fitting. A new day, a new understanding, and perhaps the beginning of real change in the halls of justice. 2 weeks after their meeting in his chambers, Judge Brooks stood at a podium in the courthouse's main hall. Reporters filled the rows of seats before him, and courthouse staff lined the walls. Sarah Washington sat in the front row, her presence both supporting and challenging. Thank you all for coming today, Judge Brooks began, his voice carrying through the microphone. I've called this press conference not to announce a new program or initiative, but to share a personal lesson in justice. He gripped the sides of the podium, remembering Sarah's words about the power of public acknowledgement. The crowd waited silently. 2 weeks ago, I made a serious error in my courtroom. When a black woman entered late, I immediately fined her for contempt, without allowing her to explain her presence. That woman was Sarah Washington, one of our state's most respected legal mediators. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several reporters started writing furiously in their notepads. Ms. Washington was late because she was completing an emergency mediation for another judge, but I didn't ask, I didn't consider. I simply saw what I expected to see, based on my own biases. Judge Brooks paused, making eye contact with various members of the audience. He noticed young law clerks, particularly those of color, paying close attention. In my 20 years on the bench, I've spoken often about justice being blind. But on that day, I proved that I wasn't living up to that standard. My actions revealed biases I hadn't even recognized in myself. He took a sip of water, then continued. Thanks to Ms. Washington's grace and wisdom, this incident has become a catalyst for change. Today, I'm announcing several new initiatives for our courthouse. Sarah nodded encouragingly as he outlined the programs they had developed together. Mandatory bias training for all courthouse staff, a mentoring program connecting experienced legal professionals with minority law students, and a community outreach program to make the legal system more accessible to underserved communities. But these programs are just the beginning. Judge Brooks continued. The real change must come from within each of us. We must examine our assumptions, challenge our prejudices, and work actively to ensure that true justice prevails in these halls. As he spoke, he noticed different reactions in the crowd. Some older judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. Many of the younger staff members looked inspired. Ms. Washington has agreed to head our new Judicial Fairness Committee, he announced. Her expertise and experience will be invaluable in helping us build a more equitable justice system. Sarah stood and walked to the podium as the crowd applauded. Judge Brooks stepped aside, giving her the platform. "Thank you, Judge Brooks," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Your willingness to acknowledge this incident publicly and turn it into an opportunity for positive change sets an important example." She went on to explain the details of the new programs, her words carrying the weight of someone who had faced these challenges firsthand. The reporters' cameras flashed continuously, capturing this moment of transformation in the courthouse's history. After the press conference, as the crowd began to disperse, a young black law student approached Sarah and Judge Brooks. "Thank you both," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Seeing this today, it gives me hope that things can really change." Judge Brooks watched as Sarah gave the student her business card and encouraged her to apply for the mentoring program. He realized that their public acknowledgement of what had happened was already having an impact. Later that afternoon, back in his courtroom, Judge Brooks noticed something different. As he looked out at the faces before him, he found himself making a conscious effort to see each person clearly, without preconceptions or assumptions. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, just as it had on that fateful day 2 weeks ago, but now it illuminated a courtroom where justice had a better chance of truly being blind, where mistakes could be acknowledged and corrected, and where change was not just possible but actively underway. Sarah's words from their first meeting echoed in his mind. The real question is, what are we going to do about it? Today, they had begun to answer that question. 6 months had passed since the press conference. On a crisp autumn morning, Judge Brooks sat in the back row of courtroom 405, observing a scene that would have been unimaginable half a year ago. Sarah Washington stood at the front, conducting a training session for newly appointed judges. The room was packed, with some attendees even standing along the walls. Among them were judges from other districts who had specifically requested to attend her bias awareness workshop. "Understanding our biases isn't about shame," Sarah was saying, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it had shown during that first mediation. "It's about growth and change. Each of us has prejudices we may not even recognize." Judge Brooks watched as she shared real examples, including their own story. What had once been his moment of shame had become a powerful teaching tool. The new judges leaned forward, taking careful notes. "Last week," Sarah continued, "a senior partner at Wilson and Reed told me he almost dismissed a qualified candidate because she didn't fit his image of a corporate lawyer. But because of our training, he caught himself. He recognized his bias, interviewed her, and ended up offering her the position." The room buzzed with discussion. Judge Brooks noticed how different the courthouse felt these days. The mentoring program had brought in dozens of minority law students. The community outreach program had made the legal system more accessible to underserved neighborhoods. Even the cafeteria conversations had changed, with staff openly discussing issues of bias and fairness. During the lunch break, Judge Brooks walked to his old courtroom. Standing at his familiar bench, he remembered that morning 6 months ago. The changes since then had been remarkable. His clerk, Mary Patterson, entered with the afternoon's files. "Your Honor, you should see this," she said, handing him a letter. It was from the state Supreme Court, requesting that their bias training program be implemented across all district courts. "They want Ms. Washington to oversee the statewide rollout," Mary added with a smile. Judge Brooks wasn't surprised. Sarah's program had already gained national attention. Legal journals had written about their initiatives, and other courthouses had started adopting similar practices. Later that afternoon, he joined Sarah in the courthouse garden where they often had their weekly meetings. The autumn leaves fell around them as they discussed the program's progress. "The numbers speak for themselves," Sarah said, reviewing her report. "Complaints about discriminatory treatment are down 60%. Our minority internship program has placed 37 students in local law firms, and the community legal clinic has helped over 200 families." Judge Brooks nodded, remembering how it all started with a $500 fine and a harsh judgment. "I still think about that morning," he admitted. "How easily we can hurt people with our assumptions." Sarah smiled. "That's why this work matters. Change happens one person at a time, one decision at a time." They were interrupted by a group of law students leaving the courthouse. The students waved respectfully to both of them, a small gesture that showed how much things had changed. 6 months ago, many of these students might have felt intimidated or unwelcome in these halls. Next week's training session is for court security staff, Sarah mentioned. They're the first people anyone meets when entering the courthouse. Their awareness can set the tone for everything that follows. As the sun began to set, Judge Brooks walked back to his chambers. On his desk sat the framed article from the Legal Times, titled Justice Reimagined: How One Judge's Mistake Led to Systemic Change. Next to it was a photo from last month's mentoring program graduation ceremony, showing him and Sarah with the first class of minority interns. Looking out his window at the courthouse steps, he saw people of all backgrounds coming and going. Each person had their own story, their own dignity, their own right to fair treatment. His mistake 6 months ago had taught him to see them more clearly. The afternoon light cast long shadows across his desk, reminding him of that fateful morning. But now these shadows didn't represent darkness or ignorance. Instead, they marked how far they had come, and how much further they could still go in making justice truly blind.